Now, if you're going to be working in any type of Microsoft administration services these days, there are some fundamental principles that are very important that you understand. So what I want to do is I want to get into some of the foundations of understanding things like Microsoft domains, understanding some of the networking technologies, RAS and VPNs and virtualization, and also we're going to talk about the cloud services and how all that fits into this. But it's important to kind of start from the beginning so you can understand where things have been, understand where things are going, and you have to consider the fact that the world is transitioning now more into a cloud-oriented environment. But in the past, everything was managed on-prem or on-premise, and we got to talk about this transition and how things were and how things are now and where Microsoft is going. So to start with, we go back in time to the 1950s, 1960s. They had mainframes, these gigantic computers that would take up like entire rooms. They used vacuum tubes. And then as we moved into the 1970s, something miraculous happened. They created what was known as an IC, an integrated circuit, which allowed basically binary math to be processed through little chips. And this is where personal computing became popular. So in the 1980s, personal computers started coming out. I'm going to draw this little symbol here to represent a computer. And I tell you what, I'm going to create another little symbol here to kind of represent a bunch of computers. So in the 1980s, companies started buying PCs and personal computers, and they started showing up in people's offices, and eventually, they were networking them together and all of that. And so this is where things really get started. Now, of course, in those days, one of the problems was we lived in what was called a peer-to-peer network. So what would happen is these computers you could network these computers together with various technologies, but there was no centralization, meaning each computer was equal. There was no computer that controls all the other computers. A network admin would have to, if they wanted to make changes, they'd have to sit down at each and every computer to make those changes or get users to help them, which was always a nightmare. And so that didn't, it worked, but it didn't work very efficiently, all right? Now, as we moved into the 1990s, there was a company that was gaining ground called Novell, and they had a product called NetWare, which was the idea of that was to use a server that would help manage machines and also allow people to share files easier. Whereas in a peer-to-peer network back originally, these machines would have to share files with each other and people would have to know each other's passwords. It just didn't work very well. Well, eventually with the creation of the file server concept, you had a more powerful machine that you could share files on and all that. And eventually Novell even came out with the idea of a server that could manage other machines. Now this is kind of where Microsoft comes in. Microsoft created their product called NT, and they created this concept of a domain controller, which is a special type of server that can manage these other servers. Now, fast forward, they came out with what was known as a domain, but fast forward to the year 2000, Microsoft releases their newest domain technology, and they call it Active Directory. And Active Directory domains were represented by a triangle. All right, and a domain controller was a server essentially that had a database on it, and that database was the Active Directory database. So let's just kind of fix that here. This little cylinder looking thing I'm going to make here is going to represent my Active Directory database. So AD. All right, and this is what we still call to this day. We call it ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services. And usually if you hear that term, Active Directory Domain Services, it means it's an on-premise domain. Although there is a version of this that can be hosted in the cloud known as Azure Active Directory Domain Services. I'm not getting into that right now. So anyway, you would always want to have more than one domain controller. The reason you want to have more than one domain controller is because the same reason you have more than one of any type of server, really. One reason being to break up the disbursement of load, these machines will authenticate with these domain controllers, and the more machines you got, you know, you don't want all of that just going to one domain controller, right? The other consideration is redundancy. If you only have one and that server goes down, well, you're in trouble, right? So we want to have multiple. The other thing about domain controllers that are interesting is that they replicate. So, for example, I'm going to make a little smiley face guy here, and this little smiley face guy is going to represent my user. So we create a user account on a domain controller. Now, the interesting thing about user accounts, or the interesting thing really about domain controllers, is that they replicate. So everything you do on one will replicate over to the other. So if I create a user account on that first one, well, replication is going to occur between both of them. And so this little arrow thing I'm going to make here is going to represent replication. So domain controllers replicate. That means that this user could log on to any one of these thousands machines, and it's going to, you know, authenticate with the domain controller. All right. The authentication protocol that is used is the protocol known as Kerberos. All right. Kerberos is the authentication protocol. What is a protocol? It's like a language, basically. Okay. Now there was an older protocol that it also supported called NTLM. That was for legacy, for older prior to the year 2000 machines. Now that protocol allowed us to have encrypted passwords and all that, and authenticate securely and all that fun stuff. The other thing is Active Directory uses a language known as the Directory Service Language, and that language was called LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Now all that is, again, this is all decades old at this point. At the time when it came out, it was cutting edge, but it is a bit dated nowadays. But it still works, and it's still pretty secure, though there are some considerations on security that I'm not going to explain right now. Now, the other thing that's important about Active Directory is that all machines have to have a name. And the name must be, of course, associated with an IP address and all of that. And so there is a service that we use it on the internet all the time, called DNS, Domain Name Service. Our domain must have a name. Usually when you name your domain, you would name it after your company, and a lot of people even name their domains based on their web presence. So for example, my domain might be called examlabpractice.com. That's my company, my web presence. And I'm going to need to have a server in my domain that can associate the names and IP addresses together. So that server is called a DNS server. DNS, Domain Name System Server. And that server will also have to have a little database on it, and that database will be our DNS database. Okay. So we'll just draw another little cylinder, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this, border it with red, and then I'm going to color code the database red, which means that this database, the DNS database, is associated with that name. Now what happens is our machines, clients, domain controllers, we also might even have, let's draw a file server over here. Pretty common that we have file servers in our environment. Okay. All of these machines would register with our DNS. All right. And this allows for the centralization of name resolution, meaning they register their IP addresses into this database, and then now anytime a machine needs to find another machine, it can query DNS. So for example, these machines all have to authenticate by your domain controllers. They can query DNS and say, hey, DNS, do you know what the address is of one of my domain controllers so I can authenticate? And DNS can reply back and say, yeah, here is the information. At that point, the client can go and authenticate. So it works very efficiently. Now, all of this together, this idea of domain controllers, this triangle you see here, this provides centralization. So we moved away from peer-to-peer networking back in the day where, you know, every machine was kind of its own boss and there was no centralized way of managing things, to now we are working in a centralized environment. These domain controllers help us centralize. This DNS service helps us centralize. So we now have some central control over things. One of the great things about our domain controllers too is we have these wonderful things called GPOs, group policy objects. A group policy object is this object that you can create that has all these settings, parameters, any type of attribute you want to configure or change on machines, you can do it through a GPO. So for example, if your boss walks up to you and says, hey, I want you to force the firewalls to be turned on all these machines. I want to make sure that the antivirus is always up to date. I want you to disable some of the wallpaper feature. I don't want people putting crazy wallpapers on their machine. So I mean, the sky's the limit. There are literally thousands of things you can do inside of a GPO. But what happens is that GPO can instruct these machines to turn things on and turn things off. GPOs also replicate. So when you create a GPO on a domain controller, it replicates over to the other domain controller. So it doesn't matter which machines authenticate with which domain controller. All right. So these GPOs can be deployed out to these machines, and this is how you turn things on, turn things off. You could even deploy software with that if you wanted to. So it was very, very powerful, a very, very powerful system for managing everything. All right. Of course, let's throw the internet into the mix here. Let's say that this little cloud is going to represent the the internet, and let's talk about a little bit about how that sort of fits into the picture. Let me just clean it up here with the mighty stroke of my paintbrush. I will clean up the internet. All right. All right, so then we have the internet, right? So maybe we've got an internet connection that's coming in here, all right? And of course, you don't want to just leave your internal network exposed, so your company would generally have a firewall, right? And we'll just put that firewall right here. And so now we have a secure way for traffic to flow out to the internet, and the only things that can come in would be things that we send out, and we could allow things through that firewall if we want to. Now, this is a traditional domain. This is the way we've done things for 20 years, all right? And in this next little section, I want to talk about expansion on all of this and where things have gone with things like RAS and all that, and VPN and virtualization. So that'll wrap this little section up, and we'll move on to the next. I now want to talk about some concepts that are also sort of the foundation of how we've done things over the years. It's important to understand how we've done things over the years so we can understand how things are now. So looking back, we have an Active Directory domain, ADDS as it's called, Active Directory Domain Services, which uses the LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, which uses Kerberos for authentication, or for the legacy back in the 90s devices that used NTLM, New Technology LAN Manager, which isn't all very new these days, but even Kerberos is pretty old considering we've been using it for decades, and I think actually the protocol even came out back in the 1980s. So we got some data technologies, but the technologies have been updated, a lot of them over the years, to be secure, so you can still feel comfortable using those. But let's talk about some different scenarios now. The first thing I want to look at is the scenario of what happens when we have a user who is not at the office. So this person is working from home. Working from home is a lot more popular nowadays than it has been in the past, so it's very common. And this person needs the ability perhaps to be able to connect in and access services that are inside. Okay, and we've got a file server, but ultimately you probably are aware that in the past it was always this mindset of do it yourself, host your own server. So your companies might have a file server, but then they might also have a they might have a SQL database server that users need to access. Let's create that SQL. All right. Maybe Microsoft Exchange. That was email, right? Microsoft Exchange was used for email, and then maybe even like SharePoint was very popular. by Microsoft on premise. So here you've got these, these 4 servers providing a service to our devices, and you've got users working from home and everything else needing to get access to those. Let me just kind of move those a little bit over here, make a little bit of room here, and I'm going to shrink those down just a little bit as well. All right. So this user who is working from home needs to access these services, but the person is not, not around. Well, let me tell you what you shouldn't do. You shouldn't just open up all the ports on the firewall and allow this person in to get access to these devices unsecurely. In fact, in the 90s, a lot of companies did that. The very first company I ever worked for, back in the 90s, they didn't really have a firewall, so you literally could share out you had a public address, and you could connect to it from home. It was really scary when I think about it. Even in the 90s, that was scary, but nowadays it's incredibly scary. Why is it scary? Because you got these people out there that want to do things that they shouldn't do, and get access to companies' data and try to do damage and ransom and all of that, ransomware and all that. And who are these people? Well, we generally call them hackers, right? So let me draw a little hacker. This little box here is going to represent my hacker. All right, and let's make this hacker look like he's up to no good. All right, I'm gonna give him let's give him like a devil horns, some devil horns here, and maybe he's in a bad mood. I'll give him a frowny face, and give him some fangs, and maybe the fangs are dripping blood okay, no, I'm just kidding. Sorry, sometimes I get carried away. All right, but anyway, that's going to be my hacker. All right, goofy looking little hacker person. All right, and so we don't want this hacker spying on my user. We don't want this hacker getting access to resources inside. So how do we get around that? Well, usually the way we would do that is you would use a VPN, a virtual private network. So the way you would do that is you could purchase what was called a VPN concentrator, and basically it's a device that allows secure connections in. But in the Microsoft world, we actually had a type of server we could set up called a RAS server, or also known as an RRAS server because it stood for Routing and Remote Access Services. But anyway, remote access services is the idea here, and with that we have support for VPN. Now what does that do? This allows this thing called a VPN tunnel to be created, which means that you have this encrypted communications that goes through to that RAS server, and then from there that RAS server allows you to access other resources securely. This hacker will not be able to see the traffic that's flowing through because it's all encrypted. The only thing the hacker would be able to see is that it was going up to this firewall, and that would be it. Wouldn't be able to see what the traffic said. So this is how we would definitely help secure things. Now, the other thing that I want to talk to you about here is what happens when a company needs to have a service that is exposed to the internet. For example, let's say that your company is going to host their own web server, okay? So you set up a web server. All right, maybe this is going to be www.examlabpractice.com or whatever, and people from the internet need to be able to get to it anonymously. Well, how are you going to do that? Where are you going to put that web server? Are you going to put it internally inside the domain like you see here? And the reason that's scary is because you would have to open up port 443, port 80, which is the HTTP ports, to allow traffic to get in, which means not only could somebody out there on the internet anonymously get into this web server, but technically so could a hacker. And if a hacker was ever to gain access over this website by hacking it, then something called pivoting could occur, where a hacker could actually gain access to these other services that are on your network. And so that's where things are really scary. So you definitely won't want to host it internally most of the time, although there was a way to do something called a reverse proxy. I won't get into that right now. But we would probably want to put this outside, right? So we'd want to put it out here. But there's something else that's a problem on that. If you put it outside that firewall, you don't have to worry about people getting allowing traffic to come in. But the scary thing about that is the fact that this poor web server is now completely exposed to the internet, so with no protection. So the way around that usually is people would get another firewall. So you'd have two firewalls. This first firewall would be called the internal connected firewall, and then this firewall here would be called the external connected firewall. Now this little network between that, we would call that a DMZ, demilitarized zone, or now the more popular term is perimeter network. Okay, so DMZ, perimeter network are basically the same thing. All right. And so now what you would do is you would only open the ports like port 80, 443, 53 for DNS if you put DNS in there, whatever ports there that you need, and now traffic would be able to get to this web server. Okay, and so even if a hacker somehow hacks this web server, you're not going to allow traffic to pass through this firewall and get to these resources. The only traffic that you might allow would be VPN. Okay, and there's a bunch of authentication and all that has to happen to make that work. All right, so that's the idea of remote access and VPNs in a nutshell for you, as well as the concept of DMZ and the perimeter network idea. Now, the final thing I want to look at with you in this video is the idea of virtualization. So I talked about how in the past it was always the mindset was we got to host everything ourselves. We got to have our own little data center. We got to have our we got to have our own servers, file server, SQL, Exchange, SharePoint, all that, and it's all got to be hosted by us. And that's the way things have always been done. All right. Now, then what you'll find is as time went on, a company called VMware came out with a way of expanding on virtualization. Just so you know, virtualization is not a new term. Virtualization has been around for a very long time. In fact, the term hypervisor is essentially the software that lets us emulate hardware. And if you can emulate hardware, you can also store software on that emulated hardware. That's the idea of virtualization. That term hypervisor has been around since the 1970s. The idea of even mainframes dividing up processing time and doing shared computing was a form of virtualization. So this is not a new concept, but VMware, they expanded on this idea, and the thing that they did that really pushed the envelope on all this was that, hey, you don't necessarily need 4 different servers. And here's the other thing. Here's the other crazy thing. If you wanted redundancy for those 4 servers, you'd really need 8 servers, right? You could do clustering those together. So you'd have 8 servers to provide redundancy for those. But with virtualization, I can set up a hypervisor server, 1 server, and virtualize those other servers. Now, in the Microsoft world, we call that Hyper-V. That is the software that does this, Hyper-V, hypervisor. Microsoft's not the one that came up with that. VMware is not the first to ever come up with that. VMware was the biggest contributor to this concept, though, so I do have to give them credit where credit is due. All right, now the other beautiful thing, though, about this is you get a really, really powerful machine. You virtualize your machines on those. You get these things called checkpoints in Microsoft. They used to be called snapshots, and a lot of other companies still call them snapshots, where you can make changes without the worry of breaking anything because you can revert back to before the change was made. The other thing that's wonderful about using virtualization is if I want to have complete redundancy, I don't have to have 8 servers. I could literally, purchase another server and have a copy of the virtual machines on that other server. Now I've only got 2 servers as opposed to having to have a total of 8 servers. Okay, so this is a very powerful feature capability that kind of started everything. Another thing that we got, and this is kind of where you start thinking about cloud computing, is with virtualization comes the term elasticity, which basically means that each of these machines can be given a certain amount of RAM processing power, but here's what's interesting about that. If one of the servers isn't using all of the available RAM that it's been given, it can share it with other servers. So for example, this file server has been given more RAM than it needs, and then SQL needs that RAM. The file server can give up some of that RAM over to SQL, and when SQL's done using that extra memory, it can release it back to everybody It's basically a pool type scenario where it gets released into a pool of RAM and pool of CPU, and they can grow and shrink as they need. And that's a small way of sort of on-premise way of looking at elasticity. Of course, when you get into cloud computing, you'll learn that that can expand across multiple machines across the board in these big data centers, but not to get into that just yet here. But that's the idea. Hopefully that now helps you with understanding that concept of what virtualization is, and with that is really where cloud computing started to come into play, which I'm not explaining in this video. But hopefully now you have a much better understanding of the concept of the RAS, VPN, as well the DMZ concepts and virtualization. And now in this next section we'll start getting into the concept of cloud services. Now, with the creation of virtualization, this got companies thinking, if we can emulate hardware, we can create these virtual machines, and we can store software on there. We can have operating systems running on that emulated hardware, the operating systems being called guest operating systems. We could technically host these virtual machines for companies for a price as a service. So the idea being, hey, you pay us a fee each month and we'll host your virtual servers, and you don't have to deal with all the headaches of hosting your own data center on premise, and the power that's needed to do that, and the air conditioning that's needed to do that, all the hardware that's needed to do that, as well as the knowledge of how all the hardware works. So this is essentially what a cloud company brings to the table. So various companies like Google and IBM and Microsoft and Apple and all these companies, a lot of them already had tons of data centers, these big massive warehouses all over the world that they could support it. Some of these companies, such as Microsoft and IBM and Amazon, and Amazon being one of the biggest and first, decided to open this up to the public for a fee and allow you to host your services in their data centers. So this is where cloud computing really comes into place. This big cloud here is going to represent cloud computing, mainly the Microsoft cloud computing. And of course, it's all connected to the internet with incredibly fast, high-speed internet connections, fiber connections, and all of that. So there's some terminology or some acronyms I want to talk a little bit about real fast here as we get into this. First off, in cloud computing, there is an acronym we call IaaS. That stands for Infrastructure as a Service. Okay? Infrastructure as a service means that a provider is hosting all of the hardware infrastructure for you, and then they are going to provide you with a way for you to interact with that hardware and utilize their hardware as a service. All right, and this, of course, is where Azure comes into play, Microsoft Azure. Now, you might pronounce that word different. People have different ways of saying Azure. Some people call it Azure. Some people call it Azure. Some people call it, I've even heard it called Azure before, Azure. There's various names for it. In fact, years ago when I was first learning Azure, I decided I wanted to make sure I was pronouncing this correctly. So I was like, I'm going to go to watch the developers. So I started watching videos of the developers, the people who created Azure, and I figured I would determine. The very first video I ever watched, the guy was pronouncing the word Azure, so that's how I say it. But what I further learned is that the Microsoft developers don't agree on how to say it either. Some of them say Azure, some of them call it Azure, some of them call it Azure. So anyway, tomato, tomato, pronounce it however you want to pronounce it, okay? But Azure is Microsoft's main IaaS system. What this is Microsoft is going to host, they've got all these data centers all over the world, and they're going to host their hardware so that you can host on top of their hardware your virtual machines or whatever it is. So you can host virtual machines. Microsoft will also allow you to have access to what are called virtual appliances, like virtual firewalls, also virtual load balancing software, because you can get access to what are called VNets, This is virtual networking, so you can create these virtual networks based on TCP/IP that are running your, in their cloud service with virtual machines on it, and then you can put a virtual firewall. So you can almost like recreate what you're seeing here in an on-premise environment. You can recreate that in the cloud. They also provide virtual storage, so you can store data and backup data out there. They support database hosting, all of that. That's all part of IaaS. Now with IaaS, the model for that, for the most part, is you pay for what you use. So there's an algorithm that looks at how much memory, how much processing power, how much storage that's being used, and then you get a fee each month for what you're using. The good news is they do have a calculator that kind of helps you forecast this. And you can even set alarms to let you know if you're approaching a certain budget that you've got on cost. There's a lot of things out there to help you do that. But that's the idea. You pay for what you use. Okay, now there is another couple of terms I want to mention as well. This next term is called Platform as a Service, and then there's a third term called Software as a Service. So Platform as a Service, PaaS, and Software as a Service. Platform as a Service and software. Let me explain software as a service first, because it's pretty easy to visualize, and then I'll explain platform as a service. So the idea of software as a service is basically they have applications that can be hosted in the cloud service, apps, if you will. These apps are 100% ready to use, ready for you to take advantage of. All you got to do is use those applications. Okay. For example, Microsoft has what's called Office for the web, or it used to be called Office Online. So that's like Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint. You can run it from within your web browser. All you got to do is just jump right in and use it. So from an admin standpoint, all we have to do is assign the users that are allowed to use that, and they can go use it, and it's available to them 100%. All they got to do is start using it. There's not really a lot of administration for us. Now, what is Platform as a Service? Well, Platform as a Service is a system in which the majority of the configuration is done for us, but we still have some admin configuration we have to do to use it. For example, with virtual machines, this is 100% IaaS. A virtual machine you can put whatever operating system on there, but you're responsible for the operating system. You're responsible for the software that goes on it. You as an admin have to manage all that. Okay. With Platform as a Service, virtual machines are set up in the background that you don't have any control over. They've already put the operating system on there. They've already put the software on there. You don't have any control over any of that. But there's still some administration you have to do in order to control it. For example, Microsoft has a directory service called Azure AD. Now, this is a big deal. This is probably one of the biggest deals of the things I've gone over so far in this cloud. Azure Active Directory is what we call a platform as a service. It is a directory service that is sort of the cloud version of what you have here called ADDS. So, now I remember when I first heard about Azure Active Directory, I thought, oh, well, this is just like you're just hosting virtual domain controllers in the cloud. No, they have completely redone the concepts of Active Directory. It is completely redone with all new web-based programming languages. It does not use any of the dated stuff like LDAP and Kerberos and all that. It uses industry standard authentication protocols in order to support all the latest and greatest features and capabilities in the cloud. Okay, and so these are where users, passwords, all of that stuff is going to be managed in the cloud. But it starts out with almost nothing in it. So it's ready to use, but you as an admin have to start creating users and all of that. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, what if I want to use my on-premise users in the cloud? Well, stand by, I'll explain that in a second. Anyway, Azure AD is a platform as a service. So is, here's another one, Exchange Online. Microsoft has Exchange Online. That is actually both a platform as a service and a software as a service, in that the admin side of it is the platform as a service, but the user side is the software as a service. Same thing for SharePoint Online. Microsoft has SharePoint Online as well. Same idea there. All right. And then you've got Microsoft Teams. That's the admin side of that is a platform as a service, but the user side of that is a software as a service. There is OneDrive for Business. That's a cloud storage that we have access to that allows users to store their data out there in the cloud. There is a product called Intune, which is Microsoft's MDM product. MDM, it's also MAM product, so it's both. Mobile device management, that allows us to manage devices. This is one of the most powerful things we have available to us. This is what sort of is replacing the concept of GPOs. This is going to allow us to manage our device settings. Not only can we manage on-premise devices, but we can manage mobile devices. GPOs can only manage devices for Windows. With Intune, we can manage Windows, Android, iOS, iPadOS, macOS, all that stuff. With the help of Intune, we can manage the settings and restrictions. We can deploy software. This is a very, very powerful product, okay, that we have available to us. It even has a thing called Autopilot, which will allow us to reconfigure Windows machines and all of that. So very, very powerful stuff that we have available to us. All right. Now, I will tell you that Azure has, Azure definitely has some of the, it has some platform as a service technologies and some software as a services technologies, but the main type of system that Microsoft has created for platform as a service and software as a service is called Microsoft 365. Okay, Microsoft 365. All right, which I forgot to add to my display here. We actually do have apps that are called the Microsoft 365 apps. All right, which formerly they would call them Office 365 apps. They're now, starting to call them Microsoft 365 apps. But the Microsoft 365 services it is a cloud service that basically sits on top of Azure. So you have Azure in the background of all this, and the Microsoft 365 sitting on top of it. All right, you can't have a Microsoft 365 account or tenant that doesn't also have Azure. Azure is in the background no matter what. And the other thing to be aware of is both of these share Azure AD. So you'll notice that there are web portals for creating users and things through Microsoft 365 or creating users through Azure. It all ties back to Azure AD. You're going to see the same users no matter what. So these two things are glued together basically. Okay, they're glued together. Now on Microsoft 365 with PaaS and SaaS and all that, you're not really going to be hosting virtual machines, but you're going to be working with these services. Let's just kind of color code some of this real quick. All right. Now again, I do want to add that Azure does have PaaS and SaaS services that I'm not getting into right now, but it's mainly an IaaS based service. That's its main focus. Microsoft 365 is strictly PaaS related and software as a service, SaaS related. It doesn't really have any virtual machines or any of that, though it can interact with them. Okay, so if I was to sort of draw a circle around some of these, all of this stuff you see here would be Azure related, and then all of this stuff you see right here would be the Microsoft 365 related. Now, they both share Azure AD, so I'm going to put a purple circle around that. Red and blue make purple. All right, and so they all link to that. Okay, and so that is how Microsoft handles those concepts. The other thing about With Azure, you're paying for the CPU, RAM, storage you use. With Microsoft 365, it's all based on licenses. So you purchase these subscriptions that have a certain amount of licenses, and you issue these licenses out to your users, and your users can take advantage of these various features. Okay. One more thing I want to explain here, and that is, what about the issue of what if we want to use our on-premise users to access resources in Azure? Well, Microsoft has a solution for that. They actually have a type of server that you can set up, and the server is called an Azure AD Connect server. Azure AD Connect. Now, what does this do? An Azure AD Connect server, this is a synchronization-based system, and what it will do is it will allow my on-premise users to be synchronized out to Azure AD. Now, it does not allow Azure AD users to be synced in, only out. But it will allow user passwords and all of that to be synced in. So if a user is logging on to Azure AD and they change their password out in the cloud, it does have the ability to synchronize that password back in. But the beauty of this is by going this route, if you have this on-premise environment, you can achieve what we call SSO. What is SSO? Single sign-on. The idea of single sign-on with all of this is my user can sit down at their on-premise computer, they can log on, and it's going to log them on both in the cloud as well, it's going to log them on-premise as well as in the cloud at the same time. All right, and they can access resources out there. The other thing I'll tell you is that Microsoft has moved into a way to where you could technically not even have a domain nowadays. You don't necessarily have to have a domain. In fact, it pains me to say this as a consultant because, I have fed my family for, 2 decades by using Active Directory, both teaching it as well as, consulting on it. But I'll be honest, Microsoft is now moving in a direction to where domains are not even needed anymore. They're now making it possible to where everything can be managed through your cloud service and domains are not needed. But if you're a company that's already got a domain and all this is still in place and all of that, then this Azure AD Connect server is going to be the thing that's going to help you. Okay? All right. Well, hopefully this has now helped you have a better understanding. This was really just a fundamentals video to help you understand the cloud service, the concepts of it, and I hope that this has been helpful to you. I want to now take a look at how we can create users inside our Azure environment. So, of course, in Azure we have a directory services known as Azure AD. Okay, a lot of people think that Azure AD is just like on-premise Active Directory, but maybe handled through virtual machines in the cloud, but that's actually not the case. Azure AD is a newer system than the on-premise Active Directory that was created back in the year 2000, or I should say before that, because it was in beta for a while. But with Azure AD, it is a fully functional cloud-based directory services that can hold our different users, groups, and handle authentication with passwords and other multi-factor authentication-based systems and all that. So we're going to look at how we can create user accounts in Azure Active Directory. So to begin with, here we are on portal.azure.com. We're going to look right here in the upper left-hand corner, and there's this little symbol right here, the 3 lines. A lot of people call that the menu button. Some people call it the hamburger. I guess it's supposed to look like 2 pieces of bread and a piece of meat. I always just argue that IT people just love to talk about food, so maybe that's it. I don't know. But another option for getting to Azure AD, you can go over here to right here where it says Azure Active Directory. But I tend to like to be in the habit of using the menu button because you're not always going to be on this screen. So I'm going to go to the menu button here, and you will look down here and see these here are called blades. All right. Another interesting name that they give things here, but this is called a blade. So we're going to click on the Azure Active Directory blade, okay? At that point, we are now in Azure Active Directory, and we can go over here to the Users blade, and this is where we can begin creating user accounts. All right. So from there, now you might notice that I have a bunch of user accounts in my little environment here, just because I've some of my other courses I've created some users, but you can ignore those. You will not have all those users right now, so don't worry about all that. But if I want to create a user account, I'm going to go right here. I'm going to click to create a user, right? So new user, and then I'm going to say create a new user. All right. From there, all I got to do is choose to create a user. I'll explain what invite user is in just a moment, but if I want to create a user, I just go here and specify what I want that user's name to be. Okay. Now, one thing of note, you will notice that my the @ symbol, this is called the user principal name, which is a username and then an @ like an email address type name. You'll see mine says examlabpractice.com because I have registered a custom domain name, which I'm not getting into right now on how to do that. Just know that it is possible to do that. You can register a custom domain name if you want, okay, but we're not getting into the details on that just yet. So I'm just going to create a user named Bob Jones. You can pretty much come up with any name you want here, and just put that in there, and then Bob Jones, first name Bob, last name Jones. At that point, you can do auto-generated password, and if you click show password, you can see what that password is, or you can say let me create the password, which you can create your own password for the user. And then essentially what would happen is you would tell the user what that password is, and then as soon as they log in, Azure Active Directory is going to force them to change the password. You could also assign them to groups. Not getting into groups right now. You can also assign them to roles, which I'm not talking about roles right now either. Although, in a nutshell, groups can give different access to different resources using groups, and with roles you can actually give administrative permissions and things like that. But again, not getting into groups and roles at the moment. From there, you could say block sign in for the user if you want. This means the user will not be able to log on right now. Maybe you just want to create the account, and then maybe you're going to allow them to log on later down the road. Or maybe you temporarily just want to turn a user off. You can actually go into the user's properties and turn this, set this to block later if you want. Then you got usage location. Now, I would like to say, even though I'm not really talking a whole lot about licensing right now, one of the things you do in Azure AD in some cases is you give them licenses to things, especially if you start using Microsoft 365 and you're working with, the Office services, and maybe you're given access to Teams and Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and different products. You'll need to assign them licenses, and it is very important that you associate a usage location. If you don't, you cannot assign any licenses, okay? And the other thing is, and I haven't really gotten into this just yet, but there is licenses involving Azure Active Directory. Right now, when you start out with a free account with Azure Active Directory, you have a free Azure Active Directory license, and then you can upgrade to things like Azure Active Directory Premium 1 or Premium 2 license, which gives you even more capabilities out of Azure Active Directory, which again, I'm not thoroughly explaining licenses right now. I just wanted to throw that out there. The main point I want to get across to you right now is that even though Azure Active Directory will allow you to bypass this and not associate a usage location, it is important that a user does have a usage location. And if you start trying to give the user a license and they can't get a license, it could be because you did not assign them a usage location. So I'm going to go ahead and just put in United States here. All right, and then we could say job title. Maybe Bob Jones is going to be a, let's say that Bob Jones is a help desk level 1. All right, support. All right, help desk level 1 support. That's his title. His department will be IT. All right, company is Exam Lab Practice. All right, and then of course you can also associate a manager to the user if you wanted to, and that way you have the ability to look up who their manager is, and their manager can be given special privileges, which I'm not getting into just yet. All right, so from there, if I want, I can go ahead and click to create, and it says this user has been successfully created. All right, so the next thing I want to show you here is what the invite user is. If I click new user again and I click to create a user or invite user. It really doesn't matter. Either one's going to give you the same options, but you'll notice that if you said invite, it's going to default to invite user. So that is known as an external. You're inviting an external user, also known as a guest. Okay, so in a lot of cases, your company might be working with people that don't necessarily work as an employee for the company. It could be like a contractor, some kind of consultant or something like that. I know for me, I've done consulting work. I've actually done consulting work directly with Microsoft before, and they invited me as a guest to their Azure AD service, and we had meetings and things like that through Teams about the project we were working on and all that. And that's a common practice for a business to, if they want to temporarily give access to a user, this is a great way to do it, especially if the user is not full-time employee, they're just a consultant or something like that. They're just temporarily working on some kind of a project. This is a great way to handle that. So from there, you would put in, let's say you've got a user. Let's say the user is, we'll do Greg Johnston. All right. And Greg Johnston's email address is gregjohnston@gmail.com. All right. Maybe he's just using his personal email address. So at that point, you would put in that information, and you could send him a personal message like, "Hey, Greg." Oops, does help if you actually can type. "Hey, Greg, please accept this link." Okay, so what'll happen is you can click to invite. It's going to send a link to this user, gregjohnston@gmail.com. They can accept the link. It'll from there it'll let them create a password. They can sign in, and they can be given access to resources. Which again, I haven't really gotten into how we can give access to resources right now. Okay. I'm just simply showing you how you can invite a guest. A guest can be invited. You might say, well, is that guest going to be more restricted or less restrictive? You can actually give a guest user account pretty much the same privileges as a regular user account. The thing is, though, is that with the help of these things called access reviews, guests can be a little bit heavier scrutinized than a regular user sometimes would. And you can periodically have these reviews done on whether or not this person should remain a guest. But I'm not getting any of that right now. I just wanted to point out that you could. Okay, you're welcome to try this out yourself. You could invite yourself as a guest. If you have a personal email address, you could try inviting yourself as a guest to your own environment and try logging on. That's a good little thing you could give a shot at right now if you wanted to. But then from there, we could continue filling all this out. Groups, roles, block sign-in, usage location, job title, department, company, manager. You're going to see it's pretty much the same thing as creating a user. The only difference is this guest user will get to keep their own personal email address or whatever email address that's put right here. All right. Okay. So the next thing I want to show you, let's go back over here. Go back to the users blade, and so I wanted to show you that we do have the ability to download all of our users to a spreadsheet if we want. We can click download users, and it will basically download it to a CSV file. Okay, if you want to pull that up, you can see all your user information in a spreadsheet. Remember, you're not going to have all these users that I've got. I created these users previously, okay, just in a previous course, but don't worry that you don't have all these user accounts, because you're still going to be able to practice everything that you want here. And then, but the next thing I want to show you is if you go over here to bulk operations, you have a bulk create option, which is kind of interesting. A bulk invite and a bulk delete. So if we go to bulk create, it's going to let us download a spreadsheet. All right, and we can open that spreadsheet up. Let's open that spreadsheet up with Excel. All right, and then what you can do is you can create users based on this CSV file, this comma-separated value file, okay? So they show an example of doing that, like, create Chris Green is the user they use as an example, and then we'll say Chris Green at, and then whatever your domain name is. You might have a name that says .onmicrosoft.com. You'd need to put that in there. In my case, I've registered a custom domain name, examlabpractice.com, so I could put that in, and then I could specify what I want the password to be. Okay, I'll just say, let's just do this little one of Microsoft's favorite little passwords right there, which I'm not going to leave it that, but that's what it will be right now. And then if I want to block sign in, no, I'm not going to block sign in. And then I could do, first name is Chris, last name is Green, job title is sales manager or something, department is sales, so on and so forth. Then you could go ahead and fill the rest of this out. Now imagine if you had a situation where you had your company recently absorbed another company. Maybe this other company is a smaller company that's got 50 employees or something. And if you had a spreadsheet maybe that was provided by that company's HR department or something, you could build the spreadsheet out like that, like you see on my screen, and then you could actually import all this and have all those users created without having to manually type all that in. So that could really save you a lot of time. Okay, so I've got a Chris Green. Let's also create another one. Let's do Larry Thomas. So Larry Thomas at examlabpractice.com. We'll just do the same password. And again, as soon as the user logs on, it makes them change their password. Larry Thomas. Maybe Larry Thomas is a marketing manager. Okay. He's part of the marketing department, which I just realized that I messed that up right there. So I'm just going to fix that. All right. And of course, again, you could fill the rest of this out, but I'm not going to do that. All right. So from there, I can go and save this. So we'll just say, save this. I'm just going to save it to my desktop real quick. All right, once it's saved, now I'm going to jump back over into here, and we're going to upload that spreadsheet. Okay. All right, so I selected where it was on my computer, and I'm going to hit submit. And if you've got any errors, it's going to let you know. Okay, hopefully we don't have any errors, and it should be able to create those users successfully. So imagine you had a spreadsheet of 50 people, 100 people, 500 people. This could really cut down on the amount of time. I also use the analogy of it's like, imagine a school university and they've got enrollments with a lot of students starting, and maybe they got an enrollments department that collects all the student data through a spreadsheet. You would be able to use that to your benefit. You wouldn't have to go through and do all the clicks. So let's go ahead and try refreshing, and let's see if our users are there. So there is Chris Green. And there's Larry Thomas. So it was able to create the users. Of course, another way we can create users that I'm not getting into right now is you can use PowerShell. There's also Azure CLI, which it's based on Linux. If you're familiar with Linux, the Azure CLI commands will be used, but I'm not showing you how to do that just yet. I just wanted to show you how you could do all this graphically. So as you can see, very easy to jump right in and create user accounts. Also invite users as guests using the Azure portal. What I want to look at with you now is I want to look into activating our Azure Active Directory Premium 2 license. Now, I'm not really covering all the licensing stuff in this video. I mainly want to turn this on because if I don't, some of the things that I'm going to be showing you soon won't be available to us. Essentially, in a nutshell, Azure Active Directory has different versions. We may start out with the free version, but we don't get to take advantage of some of the really neat features that Azure Active Directory can give us. And if we activate the Premium 2 license, we can. So Microsoft will allow you to have a free Azure AD Premium 2 license for a certain amount of time. So to activate this license, here we are on portal.azure.com. We're going to click the menu button here. We're going to go down to Azure Active Directory Blade. Okay. From there, we're going to click on the Licenses Blade. Okay. You'll notice that mine already says that I have an Azure AD Premium 2 license, but yours is probably going to say free if you're doing this with a free account. But we're going to go down here to Licenses. Okay. From there, if you look to the right, it says Get a Free Trial. Okay, you can click Get a Free Trial, and then right here under Azure Active Directory Premium 2, you're going to click that and then click to activate your license. Now, let me warn you that it can take anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour for this to actually get activated. And let me also warn you that even if you go back to the menu button, go to Azure Active Directory, it may say that you've got this license activated, but it may still take a little time for some of the features to get activated for you. So just be advised on that, depending upon how fast you move through the videos and things, if you're jumping around in the course especially, you may not have this activated yet. You have to give it at least an hour if certain features aren't working, but 15 minutes is usually adequate, but in some cases I've seen it take as long as an hour. So just be advised on that. But if you want to be able to utilize some of these features, you're going to want to turn that on. I now want to take a look at creating groups using Azure Active Directory. Okay, now just be advised that you will need to utilize some of the functionality in groups. You will need to make sure your Azure Active Directory Premium 2 license is activated. And I've shown you how to do that in a previous video. Just make sure you've done that, and remember that it can take up to from 15 minutes up to an hour for that to actually take effect. But either way, you should be able to, if you're trying to follow along, you should be able to do the majority of the stuff here that I'm doing even without that license. All right, so here we are, portal.azure.com. We're going to go to the menu button. We're going to go to Azure Active Directory blade here, and then from there we're going to click the Groups blade, and this is where we can create groups. Now again, you might notice that I've got a bunch of different groups here. You will not have all those right now. Just don't stress over that, because you create your own groups. These are some groups that I had from a previous course that I built, okay? But don't worry that you don't have all those groups. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go and click to create a new group, all right? And from there, we have group type. Now, there are two kinds of groups that Azure AD will natively support. You have what is called a security group, and you have what is called a Microsoft 365 group, okay? Now, let me just start by explaining what a Microsoft 365 group is, just because that's a very common one that's used in your business services, especially, of course, if you are using Microsoft 365. So if your company is using Microsoft 365 licenses, so you've got maybe Office and you're using Teams and you got all these different application services and stuff that you're using. And of course, we're not really looking at all that stuff right now in this video, but if your company is using that, those types of services, this is the preferred group, because when you create a Microsoft 365 group, you have the ability to essentially assign users to that group, and those users will essentially be tied together in a certain way. For example, in that group, it can automatically create a team for Microsoft Teams, so the users that are in that group will automatically be associated with Microsoft Teams. They automatically can have a SharePoint site set up for sharing information through SharePoint. Microsoft Planner, there's a thing called social media platform called Yammer they're all associated with. They get an email address associated with that group, so if you email the group, the email will go to everybody in the group. You can also give the group permissions to resources and things like OneDrive and all of that, all right? Now, there is one major thing that this group cannot do, and that is it cannot contain devices. It can only contain users, and that is something that I would recommend you remember. Microsoft 365 groups cannot contain devices, so you can't put laptop, desktop computers in this group. You can't put smartphones, tablets, anything like that in this group. It can only contain user accounts, all right? And if you're just talking about pure Azure services and you're doing a lot with Microsoft 365, you generally would want to go for the other group, all right, the security group. All right, so the majority of the stuff, we'll do here and play around with is going to involve using a security group if we're just doing pure Azure related services, and we're not dealing with the Microsoft 365 licenses a whole lot. In other words, we're not playing with Teams, we're not doing Exchange or any of that stuff, okay? So a security group. Security groups are built specifically for giving rights out to things. So for example, if you're going to be setting up virtual machines and giving certain people, individuals, access to the virtual machines to play around with it, or other resources in Azure, and you're giving permissions out for that, this is the more common group, because it's not really related to, you know, dealing with Microsoft Office and all that fun stuff. And very critical, if you are going to be associating devices to this group, you have to use a security group for that. So let's create a security group. I'm going to call this security group developers. All right, maybe we've got a group of users that are developers. Maybe they're developing applications for our Azure environment. And so we're going to have this group called developers. You can specify a description. Right here, you can also associate Azure AD roles to this group. Roles are going to give certain permissions out. Not really going over roles right now, so I'm not going to select anything there. And then you can do membership type, either assigned, dynamic user, dynamic device. Okay, so this is where it's important. If you don't have the Azure AD premium subscription set up, you will not have the dynamic user, dynamic device. Okay, but let me explain what all this is. So an assigned group is a group type that you have to either add or remove people to and from that group. Okay, so this will involve me as an admin adding people to the group manually or removing people out of the group manually. Or alternatively, we can also have what's called a group owner, and if we assign a group owner, then that group owner can add people to the group or remove people out of the group. Okay, so generally speaking, it's a very static group. People get added or removed manually by somebody, either an admin or by a group owner. Okay, now that is the generally just how normal groups, if you got a free Azure AD subscription, you'll always have that option. But with the premium, you get the ability to use dynamic user, dynamic device. And notice, by the way, that if I go to Microsoft 365 group, I do have the ability to do a dynamic user group, but not a dynamic device group, because remember, we cannot associate devices with a Microsoft 365 group, only security groups, right? So from there, I could go, let's do a dynamic user group. Now, I will also say that you can still assign an owner to this. An owner can configure certain settings for the group, but with dynamic groups, no person will ever be manually adding people to the group or removing people out of the group. Dynamic groups are really interesting. They use these things called dynamic queries. And the only way something is part of the group is by this thing called a dynamic query. Okay, so for example, if I go over here and click add dynamic query, all right, from there I've got these different expressions. These expressions are like conditions that have to be met, and based on those conditions, the device or the user, in this case it's a user because I did a user group dynamic rule here, based on that expression, the device or the user in this case will be part of that group. Okay, so I'm going to go here to property. I'm going to click. So I have all these properties that it can look at in regards to a user. Okay, so we'll do department, and operator will say contains. So that's like their department property contains the word, we'll say developer. Okay, and by the way, this is not case sensitive. All right, so it doesn't matter if I put a capital D or a lowercase d. Now watch this. I can also say, we'll say add in another expression. We'll say and or. We'll say or, and we'll say job title. So if their department property has the word develop in it, contains the word developer, or maybe the job title contains the word developer, either one of those will automatically make this person part of the group. Okay, so at that point, we'll click save. And we've created ourselves a little dynamic rule here, and we can click to create, and we've now got ourselves a dynamic group. Okay. On the flip side of that, if you want to create an assigned group too, just to play around with that, we'll create an assigned group called help desk. All right, and we'll do an assigned group, and we won't worry about having owners or any of that. We'll just click create. And so if we come down here to sometimes it takes a moment to show up, and you have to refresh the screen, but Let's do that again. Hopefully it's here. No, we're still waiting on it. Let's look at developers first, since we're waiting on that to appear. We'll go to developers, and then from there we'll look at members, and you'll notice that add members is grayed out. Okay, so people will be a member based on the information in their property of that user. So if I wanted a user really to be a member of this group, I'd have to go and edit based on these dynamic membership rules, right? And those are our dynamic membership rules. So if I went back over here to, let's go home, let's go to the menu button, go to Azure Active Directory, users, and let's choose a user. Let's do Larry Thomas here, and we'll go to edit properties. All right, and if we scroll down, he's part of marketing. Let's just change that to developer, okay? And we'll hit save. So we'll say that I put that he's a marketing manager, but we're just gonna change that. All right, just so you can see how this will work. We'll say for job title, he is a lead developer. All right, now either one of these, you didn't have to do both, because remember we used an or statement on those conditions we were setting, but either one of those would automatically make him be part of this group. All right, but the one thing I also want to point out with Azure is you got to be patient with Azure. Things do not take effect immediately. Sometimes when you make changes like this, it can take about 15 minutes before it actually appears. So if you click groups right now, it actually happened really quick. This case, it did happen very quickly, but just so you know, sometimes it can take up to 15 minutes for something like that to happen. And you're going to hear that a lot when working with Azure. Some things can be instant, some things can be 5 minutes, some can be 10, 15, some can be an hour, and there are even some things that can take 24 hours before they take effect. So that's one of the things you got to consider whenever you're working with Azure Active Directory, or Azure in general, I should say. So let's go back over to groups. So if we go over here to developers, we can click members, and we can see Larry Thomas is part of that group. All right, but notice we can't add or remove people from the group. Okay, now if we go back over to here and we look at Help Desk, which has finally appeared, you'll notice I can, if I go to members, I can manually add people to the group if I want. So because this is an assigned group. All right. So hopefully that gives you a decent understanding now of working in groups. Obviously, you can create groups through PowerShell and the Azure CLI, which is the Linux type shell that Azure has, but I'm not getting into any of that right now. I just wanted to show you how we could do this using the graphical tools. I'd now like to talk a little bit about the different types of Azure Active Directory licenses that we have available to us. So again, Azure is utilizing Azure AD for its directory services, and when you first create an Azure AD account, you have a free license. Of course, that free license does have some limitations on it, so you might consider upgrading to a better license, such as an Azure AD Premium license. Now, how do we know what license we have? Well, one way we can do that is to simply go to portal.azure.com, click the menu button, go to Azure Active Directory, and right here, it'll say license Azure AD Premium 2. In my case, I've activated the Premium 2 license. You might have already as well. You can go to the licenses blade here, and you can also enable the free trial, which you may have already done that, right? AD Premium 2 licenses there. You can also click over here on all products, and you can see what licenses you have. You guys may notice that I've got some other licenses. Don't worry, you don't have to have all those licenses. Don't worry about all that. But this is kind of where you can see the different licenses and stuff that are available in your subscription. You've got try and buy, which I'm not getting into right now. But ultimately, what is important for us to understand here is that there are different Azure AD licenses. And so we want to take a look at what those licenses are. And Microsoft has a great document we can pull up on that real quick. So if we go to Google and we just put Azure AD Premium, and just put that in, and just scroll past the ads there, we can click on pricing for Azure Active Directory. If we do that, it's going to pull this document up here, and it's going to tell us the different versions of Azure AD. First, they're just mainly trying to advertise the Premium 1 and Premium 2 license, and currently, at the making of this video, they are charging $6 a month per user for Premium 1 and $9 a month per user for Premium 2. Okay, so that's one thing of note when it comes to the licensing for Azure services. They charge a monthly fee per user that will utilize the features of that. So there will be certain features that will be available in Azure AD, and if you want those features to be available for these users, they have to have a license in order for that to be available. Okay, now what I really want to do though is click on this document right here. It says Azure. It says Active Directory documentation. We're going to click on that. And there's a nice little table that sort of breaks everything down. So ultimately, there are 4 versions of Azure AD. Okay, the free versions, that's this and this. These two are together. Okay, so the free versions of Azure AD. Okay, there is the Office 365 version, and then there's Premium 1 and Premium 2. Okay, so the free versions, obviously, you get free. You set up a free subscription. You get these free. Regular users get these features right here. If you are what we call a global administrator, which is the most powerful administrator account that Azure AD has, which is what you kind of start out as, you get a couple extra features along with that. So, but ultimately, both of these are the free version of Azure AD. Okay. Now, if you have an Office 365 license of any kind, then you get this version here. And essentially the big difference is that regular users get to take advantage of these other features right here, not just admins. Okay. And then finally, when you get into the premium versions, you can see you get a bunch of extra features. All right. Fraud alert, MFA, multi-factor authentication reports, custom greetings for phone calls. That gets into, if you start utilizing Microsoft Teams and all that stuff with this, you utilize their phone system, conditional access capabilities. A lot of this I'm not explaining what all these features are right now. Okay, I just wanted to point out that with Premium 1, you get all these features you see here. With Premium 2, you get all these features you see here. These Premium 2 features are actually very, very powerful. They add artificial intelligence capabilities and things like that to Azure that you don't get with Premium 1 and the others. So Premium 2, they definitely are trying to make it the more lucrative one for people to want to go after. Okay. But anyway, those are your 4 versions of Azure AD. Ultimately, Premium 2 is going to be the one that's got the most capabilities in it, and currently that's the one that I have activated in my environment, and you can too by doing the free trial if you haven't already done that. And you can see that it's activated right here. Now from there, you also have to make sure your users have been given a license to it. So I can go here to licenses, right? I can go to all products, and I can assign a license to it. All right. So if I actually go here to users, also I can click on an individual user like Larry Thomas here, and I can go to licenses. I can see that he has not been given any licenses. So I can click assignment, and then I can give him a license. Now, you guys may notice it doesn't say Azure AD Premium 2 here. That's because I actually have this different license here called the EMS E5 license, Enterprise Mobility Plus Security. That actually gives me the Premium 2 capability. So yours may look a little different than mine depending upon the way you set your subscription up. But either way, that's how you're going to assign license. You can either do it directly on the user like I just showed you, or you can go down here to the menu button, go to Azure Active Directory, click on licenses, click the all products. From there, click the individual license you want to give, click assign, and then you can assign that license. Okay. And that's how you're going to do that. But remember that a user must have a usage location. If a user does not have a usage location, you will get an error when you try to assign a license to that user. So if you click on a user, you need to make sure that you've given them a usage location, all right, in order for them to be given a license. And there's how you would do that right there. I now want to talk about a feature known as administrative units. Now, if you've got some experience with Active Directory on-premise or ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services, you might be familiar with a feature called OUs, organizational units. And one of the great things we could do with our on-premise Active Directory OUs is we could put users inside of an OU, an organizational unit, and we could delegate control over the resources that was in that unit. Now, administrative units are similar to that concept, but there are some differences. Ultimately, though, the point of an administrative unit is it allows us to sort of categorize our objects together, and then we can delegate control over those objects to certain admins using roles. So, for example, if my organization was broken up into different offices, like maybe I've got New York City, and maybe I've got Atlanta, Georgia, and maybe I've got Los Angeles, or you start getting into like Europe, maybe you're talking about London and Paris, and all these different places. You might have certain administrators that are designated control over those areas and those resources, and maybe the users that utilize those resources. So this is what an administrative unit is all about. So the way I can do that, I can manage that, is I can go here to portal.azure.com, click the menu button, go to Azure Active Directory. All right. And then from there, I have a blade called Administrative Units. Okay, so I'm going to click on that. And one thing you can do, you can click Learn More, which is always helpful because you can kind of skim through some of the documentation. But a couple things here, they give some examples of doing this. In this case, you're looking at, they've broken their administrative units up into School of Business, School of Engineering, security teams, executive teams, talking about maybe some kind of university type scenario. And then you got admins that are designated control over that. Now, ultimately, though, one of the things to understand here is the licensing requirements. You must have at least Azure AD Premium 1 in order to do this. Now, in my environment, I have Premium 2, so I am perfectly fine to do this. If you don't have a Premium license, it will let you create an administrative unit. You just can't populate it with anything, so it's kind of pointless, really. You got to have at least that Premium 1 license, okay? But let's go ahead and let's take a look at doing that. So I'll just jump back over here. I'm going to click Add. I'm going to create a administrative unit called NYC, all right, for maybe New York City. All right, from there, I can click Next to assign a role. Okay, so maybe I'm going to allow somebody who is a user administrator. I want a user administrator to have the ability to manage any user that's associated with this role, right? Or with this administrative unit. So in other words, if I had, let's say I had 50 users that were part of New York City, okay? If I put 50 users inside that administrative unit, then I could delegate a certain user to have what's called user administrator authority over that administrative unit. And they would be able to create and manage users. And you have all these other roles. I'm not getting into what all these roles are right now. You can kind of see what the descriptions are of these, but basically what I'm wanting to do is I'm wanting to give admin rights over a certain user. Okay, so from there I could do that, but I'm going to go ahead and create the role first. The administrative unit first. Let's create the administrative unit. So we got one called NYC. Let's create another one called ATL, maybe for Atlanta. Okay, all right, so we'll click that, review and create, and we've created two. So from there I can go to NYC. All right, and I can click to see what users are part of NYC. So if I can click Add, and maybe we'll say that Bob Jones is part of NYC, okay? And then if I go over, let's go back over here to ATL, and we'll say add a member to users, and we're going to do, let's do Larry Thomas. Now, let's just pretend that I've got 50 users in Atlanta listed here, and I've got 50 users in New York listed here. So now what I can do is I can go to Roles Administrators, and I can assign, say, the user administrative role. I could give that role over to a certain individual, okay? So a certain person could be given that user administrative role if I wanted over that. Okay, so any of these users you could assign it, and that's really what you're getting out of this. Now, you might recall an on-premise Active Directory with OUs, organizational units. A user couldn't be part of multiple OUs. A user could only be in one OU at a time. If you don't believe me, try it. Okay, a user could only be part of one organizational unit in on-premise Active Directory. Now, that's one thing that's very different about administrative units. In an administrative unit, a user could technically be a member of both of these if we wanted them to be. Of course, if you're going to do that, you probably wouldn't have called it New York City or Atlanta if you're talking about, you know, offices. Now, if you broke your administrative units up based on departments or something, and maybe you've got a sales administrative unit and then a marketing administrative unit, and you have a user who's a member of both departments, you might have them part of both administrative units. But ultimately, if you're doing it like this, where you're breaking it up into different locations, like I am here, maybe my resources are either tied to New York and my resources are tied to Atlanta, or my users are tied to New York, Atlanta, then I would have maybe an admin or a group of admins that would control either one of these. So that is the idea of an administrative unit. Now, after we have created users and groups in Azure AD, it's very easy for us to go and manage the properties of those users and groups. So just to show you there, here we are on portal.azure.com. We're going to click the menu button and go to Azure Active Directory. And then I'm going to click on the users blade. Of course, here's my users. All right, let's go down to Bob Jones here. I'm going to click on Bob Jones, and you can see all the different properties that are available to us. Okay, now the one thing of note here, when you look at Bob Jones information, you will notice that it's got a bunch of things here I can look at, but I can't really change a lot of this stuff unless I actually edit the user's properties. So if I come over here and just click on properties, for example, you'll see all this information, but I need to actually edit in order to. One way to edit is to click the little pencil symbol on any of these, but you can also just click edit properties, and then at that point you will be able to modify the user's information. Okay, and plug in whatever information here that you want. All right, or to alter. Most of this stuff, as you can see, can be altered. Some stuff obviously can't, but most of it can. That's how you're going to edit the user's properties. And again, I'm not getting into what every single little item is here in this video, but I did want to show you how you could edit the user. Okay. You can also click monitoring, and you'll see you can see how frequently this user has signed in. Of course, Bob Jones has not signed in yet, so there's nothing really to look at there. Now, as far as groups go, if I come over here to the menu button and I click on Azure Active Directory, and I'm going to click the groups blade, I can go and look at the groups that I've got available. I have the developers group, which is a security group, and it is also a dynamic group. So if I click on developers, you can see the information about that group. You can look at the properties of the group. All right, you'll see that there's certain things here I can alter. You'll notice that it lets me switch to assign group if I want, and then I've got the object ID, the roles, talking about what's called write-back state, which I'm not getting into what that is. In a nutshell, it involves if you were connecting your on-premise Active Directory with Azure AD, you could have groups written back to on-premise Active Directory, but I'm not really getting into the details on that right now. And then dynamic user, if I want to look at the membership rules, I can go over here to dynamic membership rules, and I could alter the expressions if I wanted, or add more expressions, or remove an expression if I want. So all that can be done very easily right through here. You also can see your owner. There is an owner. You can see the members, whatever members. Now if we go back over here to groups again, and let's go here to help desk, because this was a assigned group. Click on help desk. This is where it's kind of basically the same stuff. You can alter the same types of stuff. I can go to properties, and if I want, I can go and change this to dynamic user, dynamic device. You can't convert it to a Microsoft 365 group. That's one thing you can't do, but you can convert the membership type and all that. All right. So you can see the members, if there is any. You can see the owners, if there is any. There's no roles associated with it. You can see administrative units as if it's associated with administrative unit. And again, not getting into what everything is here, but did want to show you just how you could very easily change the properties of the group. So all in all, managing user and group properties is relatively easy. All you got to do is just go and click on the group, and you can alter a lot of the different settings and all of that. And some of the stuff that you see here, I'm not getting into it in this video, but you'll come across it maybe later in a later video. I want to talk now about managing device settings in Azure AD. So one of the things you can do in Azure AD is you can join devices to your Azure AD environment. Okay, now this can happen a couple of different ways. One way would be if you wanted just to join a device directly to Azure AD without it being part of an on-premise Active Directory domain, or if your company sets up a hybrid environment where you have an on-premise Active Directory domain that is linked to Azure AD using Azure AD Connect, then devices can be joined that way. Now, in my case, I'm sitting in front of a Windows 10 computer that is not joined to the Azure AD environment right now. So if I wanted to join my Windows 10 computer, I could. Now, keep in mind, I'm demonstrating this from a Windows 10 computer, but you could do this from Windows 11 as well. The steps are pretty much the same. Okay, so I'm just going to hit Start, and then I'm going to go to Settings. From there, I'm going to click the Accounts button, and we're going to go to Access Worker School, and then we're going to click the Connect button. At that point, you would put in your account information, which in my case is jc@examlabpractice.com, and then I put my password in, and then I'm going to click Join. Of course, I've actually got my computer already joined, so I don't need to do that right now, but you can try that out if you want. It's very easy. You just take your, again, Windows 10, Windows 11, whichever box, and you can join it very easily to the cloud. Now, once it is joined to the cloud, if we go to portal.azure.com, we click the menu button, we go to Azure Active Directory, we can then click the Devices blade, and we can see, if we go over here to All Devices, we can see that the device should be joined. Now, keep in mind, if you join your device, it could take a minute or two for it to show up. But as you can see here, it is NYCCL1. It is registered, running Windows 10. In this case, I can click on the device, and I can see information about the device, as you can see here. Okay, including if the device was using BitLocker encryption keys, you can actually recover in BitLocker encryption keys and all that. You can see if the device has been given any kind of associated with any roles, if it's associated with any administrative units, and from there you could also click on device settings, and you can specify, it says user may join devices to Azure AD if you want to allow that. Of course, right now it's set to all, so if you hadn't set that to allow a user to join it, the user wouldn't have been able to join it to begin with. It says users may register their devices with Azure AD, set to all, require multi-factor authentication to register. That's if you are using multi-factor authentication, which I'm not getting into right now. Maximum number of devices per user. A user can join up to 50 devices. So those are some of your different device settings. Enterprise state roaming, not really getting into that right now, but that would allow a user to synchronize settings from their device into Azure AD. And of course, here's the BitLocker key, not really getting into that right now as well, but if a user is using BitLocker, they can have their encryption key saved to the cloud. If they ever get locked out of their machine, they can recover their key. All right. All in all, though, as you can see, working with the device settings is very easy, and joining a device to Azure AD is also relatively easy as well. Now, by default, you must be an admin to join the device to Azure AD. Keep that in mind. So to join the device, you must be a local admin on that machine in order to do it. Now, you can configure some policies and all that to allow machines to automatically be joined to Azure AD, but that's not what we're getting into here. But as you can see, though, again, working with device settings, it isn't very difficult, and joining a device to Azure AD is also not very difficult. I'd now like to talk about a helpful feature that is available to us with Azure AD called Self-Service Password Reset, also known as SSPR. Now, This is a great feature in a situation where a user gets locked out of their account or forgets their password or something along those lines, and they need to reset their password. It's very similar to pretty much any website you've been to where you've done the forgot your password option. Now, a couple things you need to understand first, and things you want to remember about this, is that number one, it is disabled by default. SSPR is not turned on by default. You have to turn it on. Okay. Secondly, you have to have one of the Microsoft 365 business licenses or at least Azure AD Premium 1 in order to get this. So if you don't have one of the Microsoft 365 business licenses or Azure AD Premium 1 at least, you won't have this feature available to you. Okay, so very important. You got to have the licensing for it, and you got to have it turned on. So let's see how we can do that. All right, so here we are on portal.azure.com. We're going to click the menu button. We're going to go to Azure Active Directory. Okay, from there, there's a blade called Password Reset. So we're just going to click on the Password Reset blade. All right, and you'll notice that Self-Service Password Reset is turned off. So if we want to turn this on, we can click Select, and we can select certain groups. We want to maybe turn this on for certain users. We want to turn this on for, or user groups, sorry. Certain user groups we want to turn this on for, we can do that. Or we can click all and we can turn this on for everyone. Okay. Once you've done that, you're going to click save, and then you're going to go over to authentication methods. Okay. And then from there, you will, it gives you a few different options. The first would be that you have to give a user the ability to prove who they are in order to reset their account, or reset their password, right? So there's two by default, which is email and mobile phone. So a user can have an email address registered that they have access to. They can have a mobile phone registered that they can have access to. And of course, if they'll do an email, it sends them the information via email. If they've got a mobile phone, it'll basically text them a code. They can unlock their account that way. So that's how they're going to prove their account. You also can do the mobile app code method. Now, if you're not familiar with that, Microsoft has an app called the Microsoft Authenticator app. You can download it on your phone, tablet. It's free. It doesn't cost any money. And there's two different ways you can use the app. Two main ways you can use the app. The first method is it'll give you a one-time passcode like you see here, and basically the number just changes every 30 seconds. Okay. And another option is when you go to sign on, it'll ask you if you approve the sign in, and if you say yes, it'll authenticate you. So the default one that you got here is just that code that changes every 30 seconds, but you can also do a mobile app notification that will basically just ask you, do you approve the sign in? But you can't select that option unless you at least do require two methods up here. So you notice it's no longer grayed out when you choose two. Okay. You can also do an office phone where it can call, where basically you'll get like a Siri type, or a Cortana, I should say, type voice that'll call you on the phone, and you'll authorize it that way. Or you can do security questions. So if you go to security questions, you can basically require up to 5 questions answered. So a user, the next time they log on, they'll have to answer 5 questions, and then it'll remember those answers. And then that you can set how many they got to get right in order to change their password. So if they registered 5 questions, it'll ask them 3 questions, and they got to get 3 right in order for it to work. From there, you can also select which questions you want. Okay, I can go predefine. I can select the 5 questions I want. I can also write custom questions right here. So very easy, as you can see, to configure self-service password reset. At that point, when a user goes to log on, they can't remember their password. They have the ability to reset their password. It also, not really getting into all this right now, but Azure does have artificial intelligence. If it thinks that you are a hacker, it thinks your account has been breached, it may do a force self-service password reset where a user is forced to prove who they are in order to log on. So there's another reason why this might kick in. But most of the time, this is simply for somebody who has forgotten their password and they need to prove their account so they can log on. All right. And that is, and of course you got to save all this, but that is how you can implement SSPR, also known as self-service password reset. Now, like most Microsoft
environments where we're working with products and trying to manage products, one of the things that Microsoft has really put a lot of stock in over the years is PowerShell. And if you're going to do administration with any of the cloud services, whether it be Teams, Exchange, SharePoint, Azure AD, Intune, all the cloud services nowadays, as well as the security and compliance capabilities of the Microsoft cloud services, PowerShell is still a major component of really working with all that and managing all that. It's an important piece of the puzzle that is your Microsoft services that are out there. Okay, I want to spend some time making sure that you guys have the fundamentals, because it's really hard to understand, the more advanced things that you can do with your command line environment if you don't understand the basics. So I want to make sure that you understand the foundation of PowerShell. Now, of course, if you already feel like, oh, I'm an expert with PowerShell, you can move on. But this is going to help you have your fundamentals that are needed in working with PowerShell. Now, the first thing to understand is you can get into PowerShell in your operating system by clicking Start and searching for PowerShell. You can right-click your Start button in Windows, like Windows 10. You can go to PowerShell. I recommend opening up PowerShell as an admin, because you're going to have administrative privileges, and some of the things that you're going to want to do, you're going to need administrative privileges for. Okay. And then the other option is, if you're in Command Prompt, you can open up, if you go to Command Prompt, you can just type the word PowerShell and you can get into Command Prompt, okay, and work with PowerShell that way. Okay. Now, there's two main ways of dealing with PowerShell. One is right here in the command line environment version of PowerShell, where you can run commands just kind of like what you're used to with Command Prompt, or maybe you have experience with DOS back in the day, or maybe you're a Unix, Linux person, so you're very comfortable with the way that working with the command line environment goes. This is great for you. Another way is Microsoft has a scripting environment that is built to help you with writing scripts involving PowerShell, and it's called the ISE. You can type ISE, and that will open up the integrated scripting environment, and this will help you if you are wanting to run scripts and things like that within PowerShell. This is a great way to do it, because it's going to sort of baby you through the process of writing a script. Okay, I'll look more at that here coming up in just a minute, though. I'm going to minimize that, get back into regular PowerShell. Now, PowerShell, it really does live up to its name. It's an incredibly powerful command line environment. If there is such a thing as an intuitive command line environment, an easier to use command line environment, I really do think that you have a good case to argue that PowerShell is one of the easiest command line environments you can use, because it has a lot of tools to help you and make your life a little easier. Okay, for one, it works off of a verb-noun system. Whenever you run a PowerShell command, it's going to start with a word that is a verb, and then there's going to be a dash, and then there's going to be a noun. For example, if I want to see some information about something, I'm going to use the verb get. Get means get me some information. But if I want to change something or alter something, I'm going to use the word set. Okay, set's going to let me modify, it's going to let me alter something or change something. If I want to delete something, I could use the word remove. That's going to delete something. Okay, if I want to move something, I'm going to use the word move, or copy something, I'm going to use the word copy. Okay, if I want to start something like a service, I'm going to use the word start, right? And then if I want to stop something, it'd be the word stop. Okay, so it uses a verb-noun system. Okay, speaking of services, for example, if I wanted to see what services are running on my Windows operating system right now, again, not even talking about the cloud right now, but just right here on Windows, I can type get and then the word service. Oh, and by the way, PowerShell supports IntelliSense. So if you start typing a noun, you can hit the tab key and it'll try to figure out what it is you're typing. Now, if I would have just typed get the letter S, I could tab through all these commands that start with the letter S. If you accidentally pass the one you're looking for by hitting tab, you can hold down the shift key and goes backwards if you want. There's no reason why you should have to type out a big long command like that, because you can use the tab command to help you. But I'm going to type get ser, and there it is. I'm going to hit enter, and it's going to show me the services that are running on this Windows computer right now. Okay, now if I wanted to stop a service, like let's say I want to stop this W search service right here, I could say stop-service, and then the name of the service. Or maybe I want to start a service, like WinRM, for example, is currently stopped. I could say start-service. So I'm just changing. Notice how I'm just changing the verb from get to start. I typed get service a second ago. Now I'm typing start, and at that point, get-service, and then I could say dash name. Now keep in mind that some of the commands you run, they give you a default output. Like if you type get-service, it's going to give you a default output. But if you if you're trying to run certain commands, they need additional parameters, and that's what these dashes are right here. So you'll do a start-service, the verb noun, space, and then a dash, and then you're identifying a parameter, okay, when you do that. All right, that's the purpose of that. Let me get rid of that message. Okay, so now I'm going to specify the service I want to start. So I'm going to say WinRM. That's the service. Hit enter. And with PowerShell, a lot of times no news is good news. If you don't see a bunch of red text, then whatever you did was right, and it started the service. Now if I type get-service, hit enter, you should notice that the WinRM service is officially going to be running on my machine now. See, it's running. Okay. I can clear my screen by typing CLS. I just cleared my screen. Now watch this. I'm going to stop that WinRM service. Now I started it. I'm going to stop it. Stop-service, and then dash name WinRM. Hit enter, and there you go. I've stopped the service. If I type get service again, and by the way, you can just hit the up arrow, and it'll cycle through the commands you've typed. All right, and then it'll show that that service is now officially stopped again. Okay, and by the way, speaking of the WinRM service, that is a service that lets you allows machines to remote into your machine. If I wanted to remote into another machine and run commands, that service must be running on that destination computer. Okay, again, not talking really about the cloud here, but if I wanted to remote into another machine, I could, so I could actually type get service dash, check this out, computer name, and then whatever the name of the other computer is. If the other computer is called client 68, I could hit enter right now, and if there really was a computer called client 68 that's running WinRM, I could actually remote into that machine and run and see the services that are running on it. Another thing you can do is you can actually type enter-ps session and the name of a computer name, and then client 68, for example, and I could remote into that other machine and run commands directly from inside of it instead of just running one command at a time. Now, I'm not really getting into all that in this course because I'm sort of more focusing on teaching the fundamentals and then getting into the cloud and how we remote into the cloud, but I did want to clarify that's something you can do with your PowerShell. Okay, so that's one of the things that makes PowerShell so powerful, is the fact that you can run lots of commands locally, but you can also very easily remote into another machine. Like I can say get process, for example. That's going to show the processes that are running on this computer right here. Okay, but I could also, if I wanted to, I could say get process dash computer name client, we'll say 10, comma, client 11, comma, client 12, comma, whatever. I could see the services on all those machines. Another thing I can do with PowerShell is PowerShell supports something called piping. Piping is where you take the output from one command and you send it to the input of another command. So for example, I could pipe using that little bar symbol. That's the symbol above your enter key with the slash. If you hold down Shift and hit that backslash, it'll create that character. Okay, and then if I wanted to, I could say out-file. This is going to output it to a file, and I could say C:/client processes if I want. Okay, .text, right? And that would generate a file on the C drive called client processes. Okay. And it would actually generate it from those three computers if those three computers would allow me to remote into those. Okay, so that's the idea of being able to take the output from one command and send it over to the input of another command. I'll show another example of this here coming up in a minute. All right. But PowerShell makes it very easy for us to do that. Another thing PowerShell does is it allows us to get help on things. For example, if I wanted to see, let's say I wanted to see the Windows event log, I can type get-event log. Okay, but the problem is maybe I don't know how to use the command correctly. So if I hit enter, for example, it tells me I'm missing a value. I need to specify a log name. I'm going to hit Control-C to escape out of that. Okay, you can type get help. All right, get help on that if you want. And if you type get help, I could say get help and then type get event log, and then it'll ask me if I want to download the latest help information from Microsoft. I'm going to say no to that, and it's going to show me a little bit about using the syntax of that. Okay, using the syntax of it. But I'm going to tell you, I'm not a huge fan of their help documentation built into PowerShell. What I love to do is to look the commands up using the browser. So let me jump into the browser and I'll show you really quickly how you can find the knowledge base article on this command. Okay, so just popping over here at Google, if you type that command, get-event log, and you just search that, you're going to find that there is a knowledge base article on just about every single PowerShell command. So I encourage you, anytime you're working with PowerShell, check out just search for the command in like Google or something like that, pop that up, and you'll see the very first link there shows you how to use this command. So it even gives examples, which I really love. So like for example, get-event log name, showed me the newest, 5 entries or whatever. It even gets in a little bit of scripting here, how to declare variables and all that. Great. They have some great examples though that'll really help you. Okay. In fact, let's say we wanted to create a little script, and we'll do this in the ISE. We want to create a little script that is going to get the latest 5 entries of the security log on this Windows machine, and then I want to save it as a file, and I want to reformat it as a list instead of a table, and I'll show you the difference here too. So let's jump over into the ISE again. Okay, so right here in PowerShell, remember to get into ISE, you can just type ISE. It's going to open up the integrated scripting environment. And I want to show you how it kind of helps you when you're doing this sort of thing. So with the ISE, I can type get-event log, for example. And then if I space over and I hit dash, notice that it shows me all the parameters. See how much easier this is if you're trying to write a script or something? You have the parameters right here in front of you. All right, I'm going to do log name. And then here's one of my favorite things about it. If I hit space, it's going to show me the logs that are available. Okay, so not only does it detect the parameters, it detects the objects that the parameters associated with. In this case, it's the logs. So I'm going to click on security, and then I'll hit space, and I'll say dash newest, and we'll say 10 entries. Okay. So from there, I can hit play, and it's going to show me the newest 10 entries. It's going to run the command down here, show it. Problem is the entries are so long, this table view that the get event log tries to show it shows it in what's called a table view. It can't show it all. It can't put it in the format to where I can see everything. So what I can do, I'm going to pipe that using that little bar symbol, and there's a command called format-list. Okay. And you can see all the format commands here too if you want. You have a bunch of options here. Format-list is the one I want. And then if I hit play, it's going to format it all as a list for me. Okay. And then if I wanted to pump this into a text file, I could say pipe again, out-file, C:, we'll just sort on my C drive, security log.txt. And it's now going to put it in a file on my C drive. So now I've got, you know, if I go to my C drive, I can say dir star.text, and there it is right there. So if I want to say notepad security log, it's going to open it up in Notepad, and here it is in Notepad, and I can kind of peruse that at my convenience. Okay, so very helpful. So the other thing you can do here, you know, with PowerShell, you can declare variables. Like I could create a variable called $computer name equals client 10, and then I could throw a variable in here. I can say $computer name, and I could declare, now that I've declared the variable up here, I can call upon that variable here. This is just a very basic example of using variables in PowerShell. And if I want to run this whole thing, I can hit the play button using ISE, or if I just want to run one line at a time, I could hit this run selection button here, and it'll run just that one line. Okay. So, you know, declaring variables in PowerShell, really easy. You just use $. If I, for example, I say $num equals 1, and I say we'll say num_b equals 2, I could say $num plus $num_b, hit enter, and it's going to add those together. Gives you a 3. Very basic example here of declaring a variable, though, and then you can utilize those variables, especially when you're doing scripts. One more thing I want to mention about dealing with PowerShell: when you save a script gets saved with a PS1 extension. The other thing is, on the computer that you're running it on, you need to make sure that the computer supports. It hasn't been restricted from using scripts. So, for example, I type git dash. There's a thing called execution policy, and by default, Windows computers have a restricted execution policy. So if I run git execution on my computer, I've already set it to unrestricted, so it'll allow me to run scripts. But if you're sitting at a new Windows computer, like a new Windows 10 computer, you'll need to type set dash execution policy, and then you can set it to execution policy. You could set it to unrestricted. You have your different options here. Unrestricted is what I've got mine to, so I can run scripts on my machine. Okay. All right. Hopefully that gives you guys just a quick look and a quick foundation of PowerShell, and give you a little bit of an understanding of working with PowerShell and how it can really benefit you. We didn't really look at it from a cloud perspective here. We just looked at it on local computers perspective. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of an understanding of utilizing PowerShell commands and how they're formatted.
Now, one thing to keep in mind when you are planning to manage Azure-related services with PowerShell is that you probably don't have the commands, or commandlets as they're called. You probably don't have those commandlets that are going to be needed in order to manage Azure, whether you're using Windows 10, Windows 11, whatever it may be. Now, in my case, I've actually already installed them, but I am going to go through the process of demonstrating installing them for you, and you can actually install them on your own computer. So how can I tell if I've got the commandlets? Well, one thing I can do is I can run this command git-command, and then I can say -noun, so the noun parameter, and then I could put in star AZ star. Okay, so what that's going to do, that asterisk AZ asterisk or star AZ star, those are wildcards, and that's going to allow me to basically search for every command that has the letters AZ in the noun. And so if I do that and I hit enter, it's gonna, you can see I have a lot of commands that start with the letter AZ. All right there. So that's telling you that I actually do have these Azure commands. But the thing is that I may not have the most up-to-date version of the commands, or in your case, if you're doing this, you may not have the commands at all. So where do these how can I get these commands? Where do they come from? So they come from a Microsoft has a repository called the PowerShell Gallery. And this is where they publish their different commandlets and all that. Now, commandlets are usually published into like a package known as a module. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to get the AZ module that's going to contain all these commandlets and stuff that that I want. Now keep in mind the AZ module is not the only module out there for managing Azure, but it does contain the majority of the commands that would allow us to do the things we want to do. However, when you start getting over into the Microsoft 365 side of things, there's also what are called the MSOL commands for Microsoft 365. There are commandlets that are built specifically for security of Microsoft 365. So it just kind of depends on what it is you're dealing with. In this particular demonstration, I'm kind of focused on just Azure in general, so the AZ commands are going to give me that. So what I can do, though, is before I go through this process, we can look at the website where we can see this repository. So it is PowerShellGallery.com. This is it right here. So if you go there, www.powershellgallery.com, you can search for the different things that are available. So AZ is actually the module that I'm looking for, and so there it is right there. I can see last time it was updated. I can see what version, and it even tells me what command I need to type if I want to install this module. So I can actually copy that, and then if I open PowerShell back up, I can just paste that in by right-clicking. Now, in my case, I'm also going to do a /force, a -force, which is just going to, allow it to go through and without prompting me, am I sure I want to do this, that sort of thing. And then I'm also going to say allow clobber, which is going to allow it to overwrite any existing commandlets that are there. Okay, so let's hit enter. Now, in your case, if you're doing this for the very first time, it may ask you to install something called NuGet. It'll prompt you. NuGet is a what's known as a provider that can go out and download the actual commands themselves, the packages themselves, so you'd have to say yes to that. Another thing you might get a message on is it'll say that it's pulling this from an untrusted repository, in which the reason that it's an untrusted repository is because even though Microsoft does own the PowerShell gallery, it actually is a community-driven gallery. So that means that people that are not part of Microsoft can submit modules and commands and all that fun stuff, okay? And of course, you kind of have to say yes to that or it's not going to get installed. The good news is Microsoft does do moderation on that. So so that's good, and so that means that there are people that are moderating these commandlets and all that, and you can look at the code of it all and all that fun stuff. Okay, so we're going to let this run through. It is kind of a bigger package, and so I'm going to pause the recording while this is being installed. Okay, now that that's done installing, what we have to do if we want to manage Azure is we actually have to connect to Azure within PowerShell. So to do that, there is a connect command. Okay. And so I'm going to type, and by the way, if you're kind of wondering, well, what is the connect command or how can I see that? I can type get command -verb, and then I can put in the word connect and hit enter. This will show me every connect command. Now, you may not have all of these commands because I've actually installed quite a few modules throughout my creating these courses, but the one that I care about right now is this one right here. So now that I've installed that, I should have connect-az account. After installing that module, I should have that right there. So I should be able to type that in. In my case, I just copied it and pasted it by right-clicking. And then I should be able to hit enter. All right, and then at that point, it's going to give me an opportunity to authenticate with Azure. Okay, so I'm going to put my credentials in here. Let's see. There we go. Does kind of help if you do put the correct password in, right? Okay, so here I am. I'm now officially connected to Azure, and I have the ability to actually run commands and see the different resources that are available to me. So now that we know how to connect to Azure, what can we do? Well, pretty much the sky is the limit. You can do just about anything that you can do graphically. You can use PowerShell for that. Now, sometimes I'll get asked this question from some of my newer students to all this. They'll say, well, why would I care? Why would I want to do this? It seems like I can do everything graphically. It's a lot easier to do everything graphically. Well, first off, there are certain things, advanced things that you can't do graphically that you have to use command line for. And I know that's disappointing, but it is what it is. A lot of times when they create new features and things like that with Azure, they'll create a way to do it with command line first because it's easier, and then eventually they'll map that over to having a graphical way to do it. But if you really want to know why understanding the command line stuff is so important, it's because you can do things a lot faster and you can automate things utilizing command line. So I might have a series, it might take you 50 clicks to do something with your mouse. I might be able to write one little line of code that does all of that in one go. Imagine though that you didn't, maybe you had to do these 50 clicks, but you needed to do the 50 clicks against 50 resource groups or something in Azure. Well, I could automate that process very quickly by writing a script. So this is why it is so important to understand the concepts of PowerShell, and I'm doing this PowerShell introduction for you here to make sure that as we move through here this course and I demonstrate PowerShell, you'll have those fundamentals and be able to understand what you're doing. Okay, so now that I've done that, I can interact with Azure. Now, granted, we haven't really gone into a ton of Azure concepts just yet, so I can't show you a lot of advanced stuff, but you'll see that throughout the course. But I can show you some basic stuff, like what if I just want to see what users are available? Well, one thing I can do is I can do a search for a command that might involve users. I can say git command dash, let's do dash verb first and put the word get, because I want to get my users. I want to see what users I've got. And then I'm going to do a dash noun, and I'm going to do star user star. That is basically going to show me every command that I have available to me right now that is a get command and has the word user somewhere in the noun. Okay, so if we hit enter, you'll see the different ones. Now, some of these commands you may not have because I have got some older modules and stuff installed, so you can kind of ignore some of this. But the one we want to look at is this one right here. This is get-AZ-AD user. Okay, so let me run that command for you here. I'm just going to copy that, clear my screen by typing CLS, and then I'm going to paste that in, get-AZ-AD user. So as you can see, I can see the different users that I've created, like Larry Thomas and all of that. All right. Granted, if you're following along with me, you may not have all these users. That's no big deal. This is I'm just trying to show you how I can see what users that I do have available to me. Okay. That's the main thing I'm trying to get across here. Okay. Okay. So from there, what if I want to see what groups I've got? I can say I can search to find out what commands I've got available. Let's just change this to, by hitting the up arrow, it just retypes my previous commands. Change the word group. Okay, so here's all the group commands. So I actually have a little command, get-AZ-AD group. So if I clear my screen again, I can paste that in, get-AZ-AD group. I can see what groups I've got. Okay. All right. So from there, you might say, well, okay, well, what if I wanted to create a user or something in Azure? Well, to do that, you would need to know what the command is that does it, and we can actually, you're wanting to create something new, so you could actually change the verb. Instead of the word get, the verb would be new. So I want to create a new user, so what would that be? Well, let's see, new-AZ-AD user. Well, so this is where I always recommend you get help. If you don't know how to do something, you get help. But I'm not a huge fan of the help documentation that's built into PowerShell. You can type get help and then new-AD user. It's going to provide that. There's also a dash online command that some of the commands will support taking you straight to the website. Me, I generally just will go straight to Google or Bing and just paste the command in like this, hit enter, and then go read the article on it. And it shows me exactly how to do it. So here's some examples. I'm going to copy this example right here. So let's copy all of this. And then if we jump back into PowerShell here, let's open up the ISE, the Integrated Scripting Environment, so we can easily paste this in. It's a little easier to do it through the ISE. So let's look at this command. All right. First thing it's wanting to do is it's wanting to create a password. It wants to keep that password secure. So you're declaring a variable here in PowerShell. Anytime you start something with a $, it's a variable. Variable is just going to be a word that's being stored in memory, and it's trying to use a secure encrypted password string here. So if I put a password in, like it will do this password here. All right, kind of a dumb password, but I like to use it when I'm doing demonstrations. So it's going to declare this variable first, and then from there it says this it's taking this variable and converting it to an encrypted password. Convert to secure string. It's plain text. It's forcing it. So that means basically don't ask my permission to do it. Just do it. Okay. And then here's the actual command we care about. new-AZ-AD user, the display name, whatever you want the display name to be. All right. So maybe I want the display name, and I'm not going to use a variable for this. I'm just going to say the display name is going to be, let's do James Williamson. All right. And then the password. I could have typed that out, but it's going to be encrypted. The account can be, go ahead and enable the account. That's what that's doing. The mail nickname, what do you want the mail nickname to be? Mail nickname is just going to be James Williamson. All right. And then what do you want the user principal name to be? That's going to be like the email address type name. So it'd be James Williamson at, and then examlabpractice.com. Now, in your case, if you were doing this, you would, if you haven't registered a custom domain name, you might just put the dot on Microsoft.com name on the end of it, whatever that is. And you can find that out very easily by doing the get AZ-AD user. You know, if you look at your user accounts, you can see what their UPN names are. In my case, it's examlabpractice.com. So you would just put that in there, okay? Whatever it is for you if you were doing this. All right. I think we did everything correctly. I guess we'll find out, right? We'll hit play. All right, it says a parameter cannot be found that matches the account enabled parameter. Okay, so it's telling me that the new-AZ-AD user commandlet, it's not seeing the account enabled parameter on there for some reason. Let me just double check everything. A parameter cannot be found that matches parameter name account enabled. So let's double check this. Dash. All right. All right, well, let's take that off. Maybe they have changed something since that article was created. Let's hit play again. Okay, and it created the account. All right. All right, so at that point, we've now created a user account. And this is one of the things I'll warn you guys about you'll run into a lot of times with Microsoft, is that they'll alter things and they don't always update their documentation perfectly. And so it looks like they've removed a parameter out of there for some reason. And so at that point, that parameter no longer exists. So I just pulled it out, and you can see the account did get enabled. So that's good. And let's go look in Azure right now to see if the account actually has been created. All right, so we'll jump back into our browser. We'll go to portal.azure.com. Click the menu button. We'll go to Azure Active Directory. Click on our users, and there's James Williamson. So the user account did get created. All right. All right. So that, again, this is just teaching you some fundamentals, some things to check out and try. Again, why is this so beneficial? This is beneficial because if I start learning how to script in PowerShell, I could write scripts that could generate a lot of users based on information that I've gained, including maybe spreadsheet information, database information. This is not a PowerShell course, but you are learning some fundamentals here to help you, further things. As you start learning how everything kind of fits together with PowerShell, you're going to start learning how to script with it. And this will help you with some of the later areas of the course, because as we start jumping into PowerShell, you'll understand these fundamentals. Now, on top of being able to use PowerShell on your own local machine to interact with Azure, which I'm a bigger fan of, there is actually a way to interact with PowerShell in the cloud. It is a feature called Cloudshell. It works pretty well, and if you're in a pinch and you want to just interact with PowerShell right there in your web browser, you can very quickly just jump right in and use it. It's a little bit clunky. I do like to kind of warn people of that. It's a little bit buggy where you'll sometimes have text overwriting other text on the screen, and you have to kind of clear the screen on occasions. That's why I'm a little bit bigger of a fan of using PowerShell on my local machine to interact with Azure, but Cloudshell works great, and you can also download the Microsoft app on like your phone or tablet, and you can interact with Cloudshell that way, which is very helpful if you're in a tight situation and you need to get something done. So let me show you how to use Cloudshell. Here I am on portal.azure.com. I'm going to click on this little symbol right here. This is the Cloudshell symbol. I'm going to go ahead and click that. All right. Now, when you do that, it's going to say, okay, well, you got to have a storage account associated with your Cloudshell. So that's just to store log information and all that. It doesn't really cost a lot of money to do that, but it is a requirement. So I'm just going to say, yep, go ahead and create the storage account that is needed so that we can go ahead and continue and start using Cloudshell. Now, I also want to say that there's two different approaches to Cloudshell. There is PowerShell, which, of course, you know, is the traditional way that we do pretty much everything in the Microsoft world. And so there you have that. But then there's also what is known as the Azure CLI, which is basically Bash. So you have PowerShell and you have the Bash way of doing it. So if I look right here, I have PowerShell and then I've got Bash. Now, the interesting thing about using the PowerShell version of this is that you get access to all the Bash commands as well. So it says Azure CLI. So maybe if you're a Linux person, you're probably familiar with the Bash way of doing things. If you're a Microsoft person, you're probably more familiar with the Microsoft way of doing things. Now, I will warn you that from an exam perspective, you want to be focused a little bit more on the PowerShell side of things, even though there isn't really a lot of PowerShell related content to stress over too much on the exam. There is a little bit, so this is why we're going through this. But Bash, not so much. They're more PowerShell driven than anything else because it's Microsoft's command line environment. So I guess you would kind of expect that, right? So from there, here I am in PowerShell. If I want to switch over to Bash, I can switch over to Bash, which again is the Linux side of things. But again, the beautiful thing about using the PowerShell side of things is that you can use the Bash commands from within PowerShell. Okay, so here it is connecting back in. I've got the get dash command. I can hit enter and I can see all the commands that are available to me. By the way, you can also adjust this. All right, if you want. You can type get dash command, hit tab, autocomplete dash noun, and do the same thing. Star users or star user star, and I can see what commands are available to me for creating users and all that fun stuff. There's the get AZ-AD user command, same for groups, and all that fun stuff. Not to mention all the other commandlets that are going to let me interact with my Azure environment. So this is just another way of working with Azure. I will also say that if you type something like get-az and hit the tab key, one thing that's a little different is where in PowerShell that's installed on your computer, it will just let you tab through each individual command. With Cloudshell, it actually wants to try to display it all on the screen for you instead of you tabbing through each individual one. So it's a little different from that perspective. Okay. So it's actually displaying every single command that starts with the letter AZ. So it can get a little bit crazy sometimes when trying to do it. But again, Cloudshell is a great way to just jump right in and start using it. You can use it from in your own web browser, and you'll have the same commands that you've got from the AZ module that you might have installed locally. Now again, this being a Microsoft class, we sort of focus heavier on the PowerShell side of things, but as far as Azure CLI, which is Bash, you can learn that as well. Microsoft has lots of documentation out there. If you do a quick search, you can say get help on Azure CLI, and Microsoft has an entire set of manual instructions on running the Azure CLI commandlets and using those. Okay. However, if we come back over here, we can actually run the Azure CLI commands in PowerShell by typing AZ. So everything will start with AZ. If you just type AZ, you can get help here. Or if you want to switch over to the official Azure CLI bash shell, you can do that as well. Okay, so that brings us back over here. Okay, so if I wanted to create a user or something like that with this, you could look up the command. All you got to do is just do a quick Google search or Bing search for Azure CLI create Azure AD user, and there's lots of documentation, but the gist of it would be like this. So I would type AZ. If I type AZ and hit enter, right, that's going to show me the commands. Let's clear the screen. On bash it's clear instead of CLS. And then I would type AZ AD user create dash display. So their parameters with the CLI will be a double dash and then dash name. So display name. So maybe this user I'm going to create, I'm just going to call this Joe Hall. All right. And then the password. All right, the password I'm going to use, just going to use this password here as my little temp password that I like to always use. Dash user dash principal. Oops. Principal. You can hit tab for autocomplete. Principal name, and then I'll say, we'll say Joe Hall at examlabpractice.com. Keep in mind that if you were doing this yourself, you would want to put your domain name in there. It may be an onmicrosoft.com name if you haven't gone through the process of creating a custom DNS name. So then I'm going to say dash force change password at sign in. That's going to force the user to change password to sign in. I'm going to hit true. And I'm going to hit enter, and let's see if we did this correctly. Looks like we did. One thing that a lot of people do like about using the bash tool is that it shows it to you in JSON. This can both be a good thing and a bad thing. It can be sometimes annoying to see it in JSON format as instead of getting a more friendly format. But if you are working with JSON, it is helpful because you can copy and paste and all that. Let's go and look and see if Joe Hall was created. Here we are on portal.azure.com. We'll click the menu button, or actually I've got Azure AD right here, or you can click the menu button and go to Azure Active Directory. And then from there, let's just move this down. And we'll go to users. And let's see if Joe Hall was created. And there's Joe Hall. So Joe Hall was successfully created, and that is how you could use bash. Now keep in mind, I'm not doing, this is not a PowerShell / bash class. We're just learning some basics here. You can do searching on the internet for running these commands. So if there's something you don't know how to do, there's lots and lots of documentation out there. You just got to look for it. It doesn't take long to find it. And you can learn how to build these commands, and if you start learning scripting, you can automate the process of building objects and stuff using these different commands. One last thing I'd like to show you involving the Azure CLI is that you can actually download and install that locally to your computer. If you go out to a search engine, for example Google or Bing, and just type download Azure CLI, you can find, skip the ads here, talks about how to install the Azure CLI. So I can click on that. All right, and just choose, whatever. I'm using Windows, but if you had Mac, you can put it on Mac. So there's various ways you could do it, various operating systems, Debian, Ubuntu. Anyway, I'm going to do install on Windows. So we'll go down here. All right, and from there, all we got to do is go to install. So you got information here. There it is, latest release of Azure CLI. So we'll click on that, and it's now going to go ahead and install that or download that for me, and then all I got to do is just run that once it's done. So I'm just going to install that on my computer. All right, so we'll just open that up. Doesn't take too long, but once it's installed, what's nice about it is it'll be installed directly in there with PowerShell. So all you got to do is just load up PowerShell, and you'll be able to have access directly to the Azure CLI as well. All right, so we're going to go ahead and accept the terms here, and I'm just going to click install, and I will go ahead and let this run through. I'll pause the recording while that's happening. Okay, so that takes maybe a few minutes for it to finish installing. I'm going to go ahead and click finish, and at that point I can open up PowerShell, which I already have open. Again, right click start, go to PowerShell, and if I from there I can type AZ, and I should be able to see the AZ commands available to me. All right, there it is. If I want to log on to Azure, I can type AZ login, hit enter. It's going to give me an opportunity to authenticate. It's going to pull up browser, and then from there I can put my password in. All right, it says that I've been successfully logged in, and so I should be able to open back up PowerShell, and there it is. Okay. And now I have the ability to run the same commands that I could run through the Cloudshell version of this can now be ran locally on my computer through PowerShell. Hey, this is John Christopher. I hope you enjoyed getting to experience a little bit of this course, and I hope you'll join me on the full adventure. If you'll check the description of this video, you'll see a link that'll show you how you can get access to the full course. Now, in the full course, you're going to learn how to set up a practice environment where you can practice hands-on, and I'm going to provide you with lots of virtual simulations that you can do 24/7. All you need is a web browser. So I hope you'll join me, and I hope you'll also give me a like and subscribe. I'm trying very, very hard to get this channel to build and grow, and so I hope you'll take the time to do that.